Hi, I'm Tom Donaldson, and I'm a junior fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Today I'm going to talk about the will to believe. I'd like to talk about a simple argument for the conclusion that it's wrong to believe that God exists. It goes like this. First premise, there is no evidence that God exists. Second premise, if there is no evidence that God exists, it's wrong to believe that he does. So conclusion, it's wrong to believe that God exists. Now obviously, the first premise of this argument is highly controversial. Lots of people think that they have evidence that God exists, evidence from prayer, evidence from scripture, and so on. But I'd like to put that question to one side for today, important though it is. And instead I want to talk about the second premise of the argument. So I want to discuss whether, assuming that there's no evidence for God's existence, it's wrong to believe that he exists. Well, there was a famous interchange on this topic in the 19th century, which I'd like to talk about. In the one corner, William Clifford argued that belief without evidence is immoral. In the other corner, Uilям Джеймс defended the view that it is sometimes okay to believe without evidence. Let's start with Clifford. He was born in 1845 in England. He was a mathematician. He died when he was only 33, but in his short life he proved some important results in geometry and algebra. He was also a very impressive gymnast. He could do one-arm pull-ups. His most famous stunt was that once on a dare he climbed a church spire and hung upside down from the weathercock. As a young man he was devout, but later in his life he lost his faith and became a critic of religion. His most famous essay on the topic was The Ethics of Belief, which I'm about to summarize now. The essay starts with a story, which I'll repeat. There's a guy who owns a ferry, and the ferry is rather old, so the guy begins to worry that the ship's no longer seaworthy. However, he's very worried about the repair costs, and so he stifles all of these doubts. He pushes them aside, and he manages to convince himself that the ship is actually in perfectly good working order. So, as the ship leaves the harbour, he has no worries in his mind. He's convinced that the ship is in good condition. However, he's wrong. The ship is actually not seaworthy, and on its voyage it sinks, taking all the passengers and crew with it. Okay, that's the story. Clifford said that the ship owner is responsible for the deaths of the people on the ferry. It's his fault that they all died. He shouldn't have stifled his doubts about the seaworthiness of the ship, Clifford said. The man's belief that the ship was in good condition wasn't justified. He shouldn't have believed this without evidence. Clifford used his story to motivate a very general conclusion. It's wrong, he said, always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. Having reached this conclusion, Clifford applied his principle to the case of religious belief. Imagining a religious man who stifles doubts about his faith, he wrote, with all the pomposity of a Victorian moralist, "The life of that man is one long sin against mankind." Okay, so now let's talk about Uilям Джеймс. James was born at about the same time as Clifford, but he lived on the other side of the Atlantic in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He's best known as a psychologist. He founded the world's first psychological laboratory in 1875. As a young man, he suffered from terrible bouts of depression. He described one of these in his book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. In this instance, the depression was triggered by a trip to an asylum where he saw an epileptic in a very poor state of mental health. He wrote, "That shape am I felt, potentially. Nothing that I possess can defend me against that fate if the hour for it should strike for me as it struck for him. There was such a horror of him, and such a perception of my own merely momentary discrepancy from him, that it was as if something hitherto solid within my breast gave way entirely, and I became a mass of quivering fear. After this, the universe was changed for me altogether. I awoke morning after morning with a horrible dread at the pit of my stomach, and with a sense of the insecurity of life that I never knew before. For months I was unable to go out into the dark alone." James tells us that it was only his religious faith that allowed him to handle this depression. He maintained his religious belief in large part for this reason. He needed it to help him cope. Clifford no doubt would have thought this immoral. So James wanted to defend his religious beliefs from Clifford's attack. He did so in a famous paper called The Will to Believe. Clifford used the story of the ship owner to support the claim that it's always wrong to believe with insufficient evidence. James had his own stories, which he used to argue that it's sometimes okay to believe without evidence. I'm not going to repeat James's stories. Instead, I'll tell you one of my own which is Jamesian in spirit. So let's imagine a guy, call him Rupert. Rupert's got a date tonight and he's shy. He knows from past experience that he's very likely to be paralysed by embarrassment over dinner. He'll stutter and stumble his way through the conversation. There'll be long, awkward silences. He'll crack jokes that don't make sense. And when he tries to compliment his date, he'll misjudge it and sound creepy. He knows of only one way to avoid the problem. He doesn't have any reason to think that his date likes him, but he knows that if he can convince himself that she does, the evening will go smoothly. He'll be more relaxed, and so the conversation will be pleasant, and they'll both have a good evening. In this case, it would seem to be a good idea for Rupert to make himself believe that his date likes him if he can. At least, it doesn't seem that it would be wrong for Rupert to do this. It doesn't seem that if Rupert were to do this, he would, in Clifford's words, catch a stain which can never be wiped away. James used stories like this to cast doubt on Clifford's claim that it's always wrong to believe on insufficient evidence. He then presented an alternative way of thinking about what one should believe in situations where the evidence is inconclusive. According to James, it's all about managing risk. Whenever you form a belief, you risk believing a falsehood. But if you refrain from forming the belief, you risk missing out on a truth. According to James, you should decide whether to believe by weighing these two risks against each other. In particular, James thought it makes sense for some people to believe in God, even in the absence of evidence, simply because the potential gains from the belief are so large.